Yeah, he was in Australia. How
Mhm.
random. I feel like I didn't even know about it. Like, I'm sure.
At 11:23 p.m. on December 15th, King Charles placed his signature on a constitutional document that had been debated in secret for 8 long months. By dawn, the line of succession looked fundamentally different than it had just 24 hours earlier. A quiet revolution unfolding in the shadows of the palace. What forced his hand wasn't scandal, betrayal, or public outcry. It was a stark medical reality. The palace could no longer delay the midnight signature. The signing took place in the blue drawing room at Clarence House, a space Charles had always favoured for its intimacy and warmth, far from London's cold, relentless streets. That December night, frost had settled deep into the stone and pavements outside, the chill pressing against the walls as history quietly shifted inside. A small group of witnesses observed in near silence, holding their breaths as the king picked up his pen, performing the meticulous act of altering constitutional history. When he finally signed, the stroke was firm and deliberate. Charles's name, written in his distinctive hand, carried the weight of decades of royal service, but never had it borne such personal, private gravity. Beside him, Prince William waited with his own pen poised, expression carefully neutral, but tension etched into the set of his shoulders. The witnesses, Princess Anne, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and a senior Privy Council representative, formed a semicircle behind them. No one spoke. Every eye was locked on the unfolding moment. The only sounds were the scratch of pen on paper and the faint ticking of a mantel clock that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. When both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain stepped forward to apply the official seal. The document was then placed in a leather portfolio to be delivered immediately to the Constitutional Affairs Office, where it would be registered, copied, and distributed to governments and Commonwealth authorities with utmost precision. No champagne, no applause, only a quiet acknowledgement from the Archbishop. A brief blessing spoken in a low, careful tone, someone who understood the rarity of what they were witnessing. A king preparing for the possibility of his own incapacity, a son stepping up to shoulder responsibilities he had hoped would remain theoretical. When the witnesses departed just after midnight, the weight of what had occurred lingered in the cold air. The document was already moving through the constitutional machinery. Secure messages were dispatched to prime ministers across the Commonwealth. Legal advisors in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a dozen other realms were being awakened to review the changes and prepare coordinated public statements for the morning. Meanwhile, London slept, unaware that history had quietly, irrevocably shifted. The night remained quiet. No leaks, no dramatic headlines, only the steady, careful work of an institution preparing for a reality it had hoped would never arrive, yet could no longer afford to ignore. When dawn broke on December 16th, the world would discover that succession had changed, not in the dramatic, scandalous way of abdication or death, but in a measured, modern way, a recognition that monarchy, like any institution, must evolve with the realities of human frailty and medical truth. To understand what drove Charles to sign that document on a cold December night, we must look back to autumn 2025, when a series of medical appointments began revealing truths the king could no longer dismiss as temporary inconveniences. It started in late September with fatigue that refused to lift. Charles, who had always maintained a rigorous schedule and prided himself on stamina, now found himself needing afternoon rests that stretched longer than his engagements. Once energizing, left him drained. Sir Hugh Rathbone, his private physician of over 2 decades, noticed the pattern and quietly requested comprehensive testing, careful not to alarm the king prematurely. The results, delivered in early October, were not catastrophic, but they were worrying. Charles's heart function showed signs of stress consistent with his age and decades of relentless public duties. Early indicators of vascular fatigue appeared, not immediately life-threatening, but conditions requiring careful management and likely to progress slowly. Even more concerning, testing revealed Charles's capacity for sustained high-level decision-making was beginning to strain under prolonged stress. It wasn't dementia or cognitive decline in the traditional sense, but a subtle reduction in stamina that affected his ability to process complex information during long, demanding days. Sir Hugh delivered the news directly during a private mid-October meeting at Birkhall. "Your Majesty," he said. "You can continue your duties effectively for some time, potentially years, but we must be realistic. The workload may one day exceed your capacity to fulfill it safely." Charles sat in silence for a long time, staring out at the Scottish landscape he loved. He had waited his entire life to be king. He had become monarch at an age when most men were long retired, and now, barely 3 years into his reign, he was being told that his time might be more limited than he had ever hoped. The constitutional problem was immediate and unavoidable. British monarchy laws had been drafted in an era when medical science could not sustain life or manage chronic conditions the way it could now. Existing regency provisions, created after the abdication crisis of 1936, assumed a binary state. A monarch was either fully capable or completely incapacitated. There was no legal framework for a king of partial capacity, someone who could fulfill some duties but not others, someone requiring a gradual transition rather than a sudden crisis. Charles understood the implications instinctively. If his health declined to the point where he could no longer meet constitutional duties, the system would demand a formal declaration of incapacity, messy and public, risking destabilisation. Parliament would have to intervene. The councillors of state mechanism designed for temporary absences wasn't enough for long-term health management. Without clear protocols, any health crisis would trigger reactive chaos, and Charles, who had spent a lifetime preparing for kingship, could not stomach leaving his son to inherit the crown under such uncertain circumstances. He raised the issue privately with William during a late October walk at Sandringham. The conversation was heavy, not because William resisted, but because both understood the weight of what it represented. Charles was acknowledging mortality and fragility. William was asked to prepare for a burden he had hoped would arrive decades later. William's first reaction was denial. "You're healthy, father. You're managing. This seems premature." Charles shook his head. "I am managing now, but Sir Hugh has made clear that my capacity will likely decline gradually. When that happens, we cannot afford to leave the constitutional framework to chance, decided in a crisis. We must plan now, while we can do so thoughtfully." William had no answer. He walked beside his father in silence, both men feeling the full weight of what was coming. Princess Anne, brought in early November, was characteristically pragmatic. "This is precisely why succession planning exists. You're not abdicating, you're ensuring continuity. There is no shame in that." Charles felt the shame anyway. He had waited a lifetime to be king, and now he was preparing mechanisms to ease himself out of the very role he had trained for. It felt like failure, even though, intellectually, he understood it was wisdom. The medical reality that forced this reckoning was subtle, almost invisible to the public eye, but its implications were immense. Charles was not dying. He was not suffering from a terminal illness. He was simply aging, and aging in a role that demanded far more than a body of any age could sustainably provide. It was the most human of problems unfolding in the most public of lives, a private truth stretched across centuries of tradition and expectation, and one that would ripple quietly through every corner of the monarchy. Through October and into November, Charles quietly authorised his legal advisers to draft a solution, a constitutional mechanism to allow a managed transition, a way for William to gradually assume royal powers if Charles's health required it, without triggering the drama of abdication or the chaos of sudden incapacity. Every word, every clause had to balance duty with discretion, foresight with compassion, and the legal demands of 15 separate Commonwealth realms. By mid-November, the draft document was ready, and Charles faced the most difficult task, asking his son to read it. Why succession law needed urgent reform had become painfully clear. The legal framework governing the British monarchy had remained essentially frozen since 1936. When Edward VIII's abdication forced Parliament to clarify succession law in ways previously unimagined. The legislation crafted amid that crisis ensured abdication required parliamentary approval and that the line of succession remained perfectly clear. But the 1936 reforms could not foresee what no one in that era could have imagined, the revolution in medical science that would unfold over the following 9 decades. In 1936, illness was swift, and leaders either functioned fully or not at all. There was no grey area, no prolonged decline that modern medicine could now extend and manage for years. The human body could now falter gradually, but still function in part, creating new dilemmas for centuries-old institutions. By 2025, that binary assumption was dangerously outdated. Charles, with his advisors, recognized that waiting for a crisis to reveal the flaws would be reckless. The core problem was simple. If Charles became unable to fulfill his duties due to declining health, the law offered only two options, both public, both dramatic, both potentially destabilizing for the monarchy and the country alike. He could abdicate, a process requiring parliamentary approval, public announcement, and permanent surrender of the crown, or be declared incapacitated, equally public and dramatic, involving medical assessments, Privy Council intervention, and installation of a regent. Neither option accounted for what his physicians predicted, a gradual decline in capacity that would leave some duties manageable and others impossible. No legal provision existed for a king to step back partially, transferring select constitutional functions to his heir while retaining others. And there was certainly no provision for doing so quietly, with dignity, avoiding a spectacle that would dominate headlines and invite speculation. Charles had watched his mother navigate similar questions. Queen Elizabeth, determined to serve until her death, had gradually reduced her schedule, delegating responsibilities to Charles. But those delegations were informal, guided by tradition rather than codified law. When Elizabeth died, the transition was sudden, yet mitigated by careful, long-term planning. Charles did not want his own transition to rely on sudden death or public drama. He wanted a mechanism that acknowledged reality, allowed managed change, and protected both the institution and his son from unnecessary trauma. These were practical, not hostile inquiries raised by realms that needed clarity on constitutional functioning should Britain's monarch face health challenges. The palace's inability to answer such questions was itself a revealing signal of systemic vulnerability and fragility within centuries of ceremony. Princess Anne, seasoned in observing structural weaknesses within the monarchy, pressed hardest for immediate action. "We cannot govern on hope alone," she told Charles at Windsor in November. "We cannot assume you will remain fully capable until sudden death. Medical reality no longer works that way." The legal team faced extraordinary challenges. They had to create a mechanism legally binding across 15 Commonwealth realms, each with its own constitutional structure. The language had to be precise to prevent ambiguity, yet flexible enough to cover multiple scenarios. Most delicately, it had to avoid implying that Charles was weak or preparing to abdicate. The solution was carefully crafted. First, it did not require a formal declaration of incapacity. Instead, the monarch could voluntarily transfer specific constitutional powers if medical advice suggested it would better serve the crown. The decision remained entirely with Charles, grounded in medical reality rather than political pressure. Second, the transfer could be partial and gradual. William could assume powers over areas such as hosting state visits or conducting investments, while Charles retained others, like weekly audiences with the Prime Minister or approval of certain state documents. The mechanism acknowledged that capacity was not binary. Someone could excel in certain areas while struggling in others. Third, and most importantly, the arrangement was reversible. If Charles's health stabilized, powers could return. This was not abdication disguised as health management. It was genuine constitutional flexibility. Commonwealth realms consulted secretly during the drafting process and responded with cautious support, many recognizing the need for modernization in their own succession laws. Canadian advisors were particularly helpful, drawing on experience with prime ministerial health transitions. By early December, the document sat on Charles's desk at Clarence House, waiting for the moment to be shared with the person most affected, Prince William, his son, his heir, the man who would bear the weight of this new constitutional arrangement. The envelope arrived at Kensington Palace on December 12th, delivered by royal courier under the highest security. William's private secretary brought it with an apologetic expression, signalling immediately that this was no routine correspondence. "From His Majesty," the secretary said quietly. "For your eyes only, to be read in private." William dismissed the meeting and sat alone in his study. Winter darkness pressed against the windows. The envelope was thick, sealed with Charles's personal stamp. Inside were two items: the formal draft of the Transitional Regency Protocol and a handwritten letter from his father on Clarence House stationery. William read the letter first. "My dearest William," it began in Charles's sloping script. "What follows is difficult to write and may be difficult to read, but it is necessary. I believe you will understand why." The letter explained, more personally than any medical report could, Charles's fatigue, consultations, and growing awareness that his capacity to serve might be limited in ways he had never anticipated. Charles wrote with vulnerability William had rarely seen, acknowledging fears and frustrations the king would never reveal publicly. "I do not know how much time I have to serve effectively," he wrote. "It may be many years, or fewer than I hope, but I cannot leave these questions unanswered until crisis forces answers upon us both." The letter concluded with a request. "Read the document. Consider what it asks of you, and when ready, let us discuss it together. This is not a decision I can make alone." William set the letter aside and opened the legal draft. Dense constitutional terminology filled the pages, but its meaning was clear. If Charles's health declined to the point where medical advice suggested a partial transfer of duties, William could assume those duties without the drama of abdication or formal incapacity proceedings. He read it twice, then stared blankly. His first emotion was not readiness or duty. It was refusal. He did not want this responsibility. Not now. Not like this. His father had waited a lifetime to be king. William had expected to wait similarly long. Assuming royal powers while his father still lived, still wore the crown, felt profoundly wrong, heavy with history, and morally complex in ways he could barely articulate. An hour later, Catherine found him still in the darkening study. She turned on a lamp and sat beside him without speaking, waiting for him to find words. "He wants me to share the crown," William finally said, voice low, weighted with history. "While he is still alive, while he can still function." Catherine glanced at the documents on his desk, understanding the enormity and delicate humanity of the moment. Is he ill? Not acutely, but his strength was declining gradually, and he wanted to manage the transition while he could still make clear, conscious decisions about it. Catherine considered this carefully. "That seems wise." William shook his head. "It feels like I'm waiting for him to weaken, so I can take his place." "That's not what this is," Catherine said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "This is your father trying to protect you, making sure the transition happens thoughtfully, not in crisis. He is giving you time to prepare. That is a gift, not a burden." It felt like both. They sat in silence for a while, the distant hum of London's evening traffic a soft reminder of the world beyond their private weight of succession. The responsibility pressed down on them with the force they had intellectually prepared for, but emotionally were still not ready to bear. Catherine spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Your father spent 70 years waiting, watching his mother work until she died in office. He knows what that cost her. And he knows what it would cost you if he did the same. This is not weakness, William. This is him loving you enough to spare you the worst of what he endured." William looked at her, seeing the strength that had made her such a steady partner through everything the royal role had thrown at them. "You think I should agree to this?" "I think you should talk to him," Catherine replied, "and understand that refusing this does not protect him. It only makes the inevitable harder when it comes." William knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were separate challenges. He requested a meeting with his father for December 14th, and the 2 days between gave him time to consult privately with constitutional experts, to understand fully what the document entailed, and to prepare for a conversation he had never imagined having. The meeting took place at Clarence House on a cold evening scented with approaching snow. Charles had set aside 2 hours, clearing his calendar completely. They sat in the same blue drawing room where the signing would eventually occur, though neither knew it yet. William began carefully. "I have read the document and your letter, and I understand why you believe this is necessary." Charles waited, sensing hesitation in his son's voice, but did not wish to appear eager. "I do not want people to think I am pushing you aside," William continued. Charles leaned forward, expression gentle but serious. "You have never been eager for my position. William, you have carried your role with reluctance, duty, and equal measure. No one who knows you could possibly believe you are pushing me aside." "Then what will they believe?" William asked. "That you are too weak to continue, that the crown is crumbling." Charles shook his head. "They will believe because we will tell them clearly that we are modernizing succession procedures, that we are planning responsibly for realities medical science has made newly relevant. There is no shame in that." William looked down at his hands. "This means you are preparing to step back." "Correct," Charles said gently. "I am preparing for the possibility that I may need to step back. If that time never comes, the protocol sits unused. But if it does, we will be ready. and you will not be forced to assume everything at once. During a conversation that stretched over an hour, they discussed practical details, navigated emotional undercurrents, and explored the realities of a gradual transfer of power. Charles explained the medical truths he faced. William expressed fears of assuming authority prematurely. Gradually, through the kind of honest conversation fathers and sons rarely manage, they reached a shared understanding. By the time William left Clarence House that evening, he had not yet agreed to sign, but he had agreed to consider it seriously. Charles, reading his son's face, understood that consideration would lead to acceptance, not because William wanted this, but because he understood, as Charles did, that the crown required it. 2 days later, on the evening of December 15th, William returned to Clarence House with Catherine. He had made his decision. Though it pained him, it felt like stepping into his father's shadow before his father had fully stepped out of it. He understood that this was what duty required. The signing would occur that night, and by morning, the line of succession would function differently than it had for nearly 90 years. The blue drawing room at Clarence House had been prepared meticulously for a ceremony that no one present would ever forget, even if few outside would fully comprehend its significance. The furniture had been arranged with careful attention to both formality and intimacy. A mahogany desk, borrowed from the palace archive and historically used for treaty signings, sat at the centre. 2 chairs were placed before it, one for Charles, one for William. Behind them, space had been made for witnesses to stand at a respectful distance, close enough to observe, but far enough to maintain the solemnity of the moment. Princess Anne arrived first, punctual as always, dressed in a dark suit appropriate for the gravity of the occasion. She greeted Charles with a brief kiss on the cheek and a searching look that silently asked whether he was certain of this course. Charles's slight nod confirmed that he was. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived moments later, lending spiritual weight to what was fundamentally a constitutional proceeding. He had been briefed in detail and understood that, while ceremonial, his witness would be recorded in history. The Church of England had been closely tied to succession questions since Henry VIII, and this moment quietly marked a new evolution in that relationship. The Lord Chamberlain, Baron Parker, came next, carrying the official seals that would validate the document. He moved with the efficiency of someone experienced in countless state occasions, but even he seemed moved by the unusual gravity of this act. Finally, Margaret Whitmore represented the Privy Council, ensuring the signing complied with constitutional requirements, and that the Council would ratify the changes at their next meeting. She had served in constitutional law for over 30 years, but had never witnessed anything like this, a king voluntarily constraining his own power in anticipation of future incapacity. Prince William arrived at 10:58 p.m. with Catherine, who would not witness the signing but remained nearby at his request, close enough for reassurance, yet respecting the constitutional formality. Charles and William stood together for a moment, father and son, king and heir, sharing a silence heavy with decades of history, complex emotions, and the weight of the crown. Charles gestured to the chairs, and they sat. The document lay on the desk between them, illuminated by 2 standing lamps casting a warm glow. The Lord Chamberlain had placed 2 fountain pens, traditional instruments for state documents, each bearing the royal cipher. The Archbishop stepped forward, voice low but clear. "Let us begin with a moment of prayer." The blessing was brief but heartfelt, asking for wisdom, strength, and divine guidance for both men undertaking this solemn act. The words were traditional, drawn from centuries of church practice, yet newly resonant in this modern context where faith and constitutional duty intersected unexpectedly. When the prayer concluded, the Lord Chamberlain formally presented the document, reading its title aloud: The Transitional Regency Protocol, establishing revised procedures for the transfer of royal powers in circumstances of the sovereign's partial or progressive incapacity. The language was bureaucratic, deliberately dry, yet everyone understood its profound meaning. Charles acknowledging his mortality and fragility, William accepting a burden he had hoped would come much later. Charles took up his pen first, reading the document one final time. His reading glasses reflected the lamplight. His expression was composed but unmistakably emotional. When he finally signed, the room held its collective breath. His signature was firm, each letter deliberate, the final flourish on the R decisive as ever, but different, monumental, historic. Charles laid down his pen and looked at William. The expression exchanged carried apology, hope, sorrow, and pragmatism all at once. William understood in that instant that his father was not giving up, merely preparing wisely for the future that both duty and love demanded. He was giving William the tools to take over gracefully if that became necessary. It was, in its way, an act of love. William picked up his own pen, his hand, witnesses later recalled, steady. He read through the passages that pertained specifically to his responsibilities, the powers he would assume if the protocol were ever activated, the duties he would perform in his father's name. Then he signed. William did not use a regal signature, as he would when he became king. This was not about assuming the throne. This was about sharing its burden. When both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain applied the official seal, pressing it firmly into the red wax that had been prepared. The sound of the seal breaking was loud, resonant, echoing briefly in the high-ceilinged room. The silence seemed heavier than it should have been, final and irrevocable. Dame Margaret stepped forward to countersign as witness, followed by the Archbishop and Princess Anne. Each signature added weight, transforming the document from theory into constitutional reality, turning abstract planning into living, binding law. Anne, as she signed, allowed herself a rare display of emotion. She placed her hand briefly on Charles's shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that several witnesses noted it in later accounts. Charles reached up and covered her hand with his own, a moment of sibling solidarity that spoke to decades of shared duty, unwavering support, and mutual respect. The Archbishop offered a final blessing, hand raised over both Charles and William. May God grant you both strength for the days ahead, wisdom in the exercise of your duties, and peace in the knowledge that you serve a purpose greater than yourselves. When the ceremony concluded at 11:27 p.m., there was no applause, no formal congratulations, only the quiet weight of history being observed. The Lord Chamberlain collected the documents, now sealed and witnessed, and placed them in the leather portfolio that would carry them to the Constitutional Affairs Office for official registration. The witnesses departed quietly, each understanding that what they had seen would be discussed for years, analysed by historians, and remembered as a turning point in how modern monarchy managed succession and adapted to the realities of human frailty. But in that moment, as they left Clarence House and returned to London's sleeping streets, they carried only a sense of having witnessed something both profoundly sad and remarkably wise. Charles and William remained in the blue drawing room after everyone else had gone. Catherine rejoined them, moving to William's side without a word. Queen Camilla, who had waited in her private sitting room during the signing, entered quietly and stood beside Charles for several minutes. The four of them simply existed together in the aftermath of what had been done. No one felt the need to speak. The document was signed. The future was now structured differently than it had been an hour earlier, and all of them, in their different ways, were processing what that meant, allowing the enormity of the moment to settle slowly around them. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at William. William nodded. It was the right thing to do, but not an easy thing. Catherine added quietly, and Charles smiled faintly. The right things rarely are. They parted shortly after midnight, Charles and Camilla returning to their private apartments, William and Catherine departing for Kensington Palace. The lights at Clarence House dimmed, and London settled into the few remaining hours before dawn would bring the news to a world that did not yet know the monarchy had fundamentally changed, what changed, and what it meant for the crown. The Buckingham Palace press office released the statement at precisely 7 a.m. on December 16th, timed to reach British morning broadcasts while accommodating time zones across the Commonwealth. The language was careful, measured, designed to inform without alarming. Within minutes, the statement was being analysed by constitutional experts across Britain. The initial reaction was not alarm, but curiosity. Regency protocols had not been significantly updated since the mid-20th century. That Charles had chosen to modernise them seemed responsible rather than concerning. But as journalists and legal scholars began parsing the details released in accompanying briefing documents, the fuller picture emerged. This was not simply administrative housekeeping. This was a fundamental restructuring of how succession could function, creating flexibility where rigidity had previously existed. It was a considered approach to evolving monarchy in the 21st century, balancing tradition with practical foresight. The key change, explained in a detailed annex prepared for Parliament and Commonwealth legislatures, centred on the concept of transitional regency. Unlike traditional regency, which required formal declarations of complete incapacity, this new protocol allowed for voluntary partial transfer of powers based on medical advice. Rather than political determination, practically this meant that if Charles's doctors advised that certain royal duties were becoming too demanding for his health, William could assume those specific duties without Charles abdicating or being declared fully incapacitated. The king would retain his title, his position, and those constitutional functions he remained capable of performing, but the burden of the role would be distributed based on medical reality rather than legal fiction, ensuring both stability and dignity for the monarchy. The public reaction, measured through social media and snap polling conducted throughout the morning, was overwhelmingly positive. 79% of Britons surveyed expressed approval for the changes, with many noting that it seemed wise for Charles to plan proactively rather than wait for crisis. Only 11% expressed concern, primarily focused on whether the changes suggested Charles's health was worse than publicly known. The palace moved quickly to address that concern. A supplementary statement released at 10 a.m. clarified that His Majesty remains in good health and fully capable of fulfilling his duties. This protocol has been enacted as a matter of responsible planning, not in response to immediate medical necessity across the Commonwealth. Reactions varied slightly, but remained generally supportive. Canada's Prime Minister issued a statement praising the King's foresight and confirming that Canadian constitutional arrangements would be updated to reflect the new protocol. Australia's response was more measured, with Republican voices using the moment to argue for severing ties with the monarchy entirely. But even there, polling showed majority support for the King's decision. New Zealand's Prime Minister, who had privately requested clarity on exactly these issues months earlier, expressed relief that the protocol now existed. "This provides the certainty that our constitutional arrangements require," she said in a brief address to Parliament. American media coverage was characteristically confused. Several major outlets struggled to explain what regency meant in a monarchical context, with some initially reporting incorrectly that Charles had abdicated. By midday, corrections had been issued and more nuanced analysis emerged. But the coverage revealed how little Americans understood the constitutional mechanics of monarchy and how revolutionary Charles's decision truly was. What most coverage missed, both in Britain and internationally, was the deeper significance of what Charles had done. He had not simply updated legal procedures, he had confronted the fundamental tension at the heart of modern monarchy, the conflict between the symbolic importance of a lifetime sovereign and the practical reality that human bodies and minds decline in ways that medicine can now extend but not prevent. For centuries, monarchs had died in office because they had no choice. Modern medicine had created choice, but constitutional law had not caught up. Charles's protocol was an attempt to bridge that gap, to create a mechanism for managed transition that honoured both the institution's need for continuity and the individual's need for dignity. William, briefed on the morning's coverage at Kensington Palace, felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The public had received the news calmly, which was good, but he also understood that the protocol's existence would now colour every future speculation about Charles's health. Any minor illness, any reduced schedule, would trigger questions about whether the transitional regency was being activated. Catherine, reading through the press summaries beside him, spoke. "The concern will arise every time he cancels an engagement. Now people will wonder if this is the beginning." William nodded grimly. "That is the price of transparency. We have acknowledged that his capacity may decline. Now, every sign of that decline will be magnified. But the alternative," Catherine countered, "was waiting until a crisis forced the transition. This way, at least, there is a plan." Later that morning, William attended a working breakfast meeting with Charles, Anne, and senior constitutional advisers. The atmosphere was businesslike, focused on implementation details and Commonwealth coordination. But beneath the procedural discussions, a new dynamic was evident. Charles and William were no longer simply king and heir. They were now constitutional partners. Linked by a document that acknowledged the transfer of power between them was no longer a distant theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that could unfold at any time, altering the way the monarchy functioned for generations. Princess Anne, observing the subtle shift in how her brother and nephew interacted, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. For years, she had pushed for exactly this kind of forward planning, and watching it unfold validated her belief. The monarchy survived, not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful adaptation, showing that careful planning could reconcile duty, love, and legacy. By evening, as the news cycle moved on to other stories, the palace had successfully managed the transition of public understanding. The Transitional Regency Protocol was now part of Britain's constitutional framework, accepted by Parliament, coordinated across the Commonwealth, and broadly supported by the public. Inside Kensington Palace, William sat in his study reviewing documents for the following day's engagements. The weight of what had changed settled over him more fully. The crown he would one day wear had moved closer, not through his father's death, but through his father's wisdom in planning for incapacity. It was not the inheritance he had imagined, but perhaps it was the inheritance he needed. Modern monarchy required not dramatic abdication or sudden succession, but measured transition, planned with care and executed with dignity. Catherine found him an hour later, staring out at the December darkness. "You are thinking too much," she said gently. William smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. She moved beside him, their shoulders touching in the comfortable silence of a partnership that had weathered everything royal life had demanded. "Your father gave you time," she said. "Time to prepare, time to grow into what is coming. That is more than most heirs received." William knew she was right. Charles, who had waited 70 years, had given his son something he himself had never received, a gradual path to the crown rather than a sudden shock, partnership instead of abrupt replacement. It was, William realised, perhaps the greatest gift his father could have given, not the crown itself, which would come eventually regardless, but the framework to assume it without destroying either himself or the institution in the process. Outside, London continued its evening rhythms, unaware that in a quiet study at Kensington Palace, the future king was processing a change that would define how succession functioned for generations to come. The document, signed at 11:23 p.m. on December 15th, had altered more than legal procedures. It had altered the relationship between father and son, between king and heir, between present and future, and imbued the institution with a resilience built on foresight, love, and understanding. And though the public would never fully grasp the emotional weight of that alteration, those who had witnessed it, those who had signed it, and those who would live with its implications understood. The crown had not weakened, it had adapted, and in that adaptation lay its continued survival. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, share, and comment to help more people discover the remarkable evolution of the modern monarchy and the wisdom behind Charles and William's unprecedented partnership.